Hello, and welcome to my second reading of A.T. Fomenko's History, Fiction, or Science, Chronology 1. Before I get started, I wanted to give a thanks to the two people who have volunteered to help me get through the very long and daunting task of listing out the Hebrew root words so that we can very much understand the language and what was really being said in the Hebrew portions of the scriptures, which I believe will shed a great deal of light on the Greek portions as well. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody for your well-wishing and your kind words, and most of all your prayers. I value them more than silver and gold. So without further ado, I will start on the section History of the New Chronology. The history of the New Chronology and its development can be divided into three periods, albeit arbitrarily. The first stage, the 16th through 20th century, when various researchers periodically discovered major inconsistencies in the edifice of the Scaligerian chronology. We shall quote the names of some familiar scientists that dissented with the chronology of Scaliger Petavius and reckon that the real ancient and medieval chronology differed significantly. D'Arcilla, the 16th century professor of the Salamanca University, see Chronicles 1, Chapter 1. The information in his chronological research is of a rather volatile nature, and it was only by accident that N.A. Morozov managed to learn of it. It is known merely that D'Arcilla claimed ancient history to have been forged in the Middle Ages. However, we regrettably failed to have found any of his works. The Salamanca University could not give us any information about them either. Sir Isaac Newton, 1643 through 1727, the great English scientist, physicist, and mathematician, devoted a large part of his life to chronology and published a large volume entitled The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended, to which is prefixed a short chronicle from the first memory of things in Europe to the conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great. See 1298. More details in Chronology 1, Chapter 1. Jean Hardouin, 1646-1729, eminent French scientist and author of a large number of works on philology, theology, history, archaeology, and numismatics. He was also director of the French Royal Library and wrote a few chronological works with sharp criticisms of the entire Scaligerian chronology. He was of the opinion that most of the so-called ancient artifacts were either counterfeit or belonged to a much more recent age. See details in Chronology 7, Appendix 3. Peter Nikiforovich Krekshin, 1684 through 1763, the personal secretary of Peter the Great, wrote a book criticizing the contemporary version of Roman history. It was still fresh in his day and age, and wasn't taken for granted the way that it is today. See details in Chronology 4, Chapter 1430. Robert Baldauf, the German philologist of the late 19th through early 20th century, assistant professor at the Basel University and author of the 4 volumes entitled History and Criticisms, he came to the conclusion that the ancient literary works had been a lot more recent than one was accustomed to think. Guided by philological considerations, Baldauf proved that those works were all medieval in their origins. See details in Chronology 7, Appendix 3. Edwin Johnson, 1843 through 1901, English historian of the 19th century, criticized the Scaligerian chronology severally severely in his works, 1214 and 1215, claiming that they needed to be truncated drastically. See details in Chronology 1, Chapter 1. Nikolai Alexandrovich Morozov, 1854 through 1946, a prominent Russian scientist and encyclopedist, made a breakthrough in chronological studies. He criticized the Scaligian version of chronology and history extensively. He offered the concepts of several new natural scientific methods of analyzing chronology and introduced scientific approaches to chronology, making the latter a science de facto. See details in Chronology 1, Chapter 1. Wilhelm Kmeyer, late 19th century through 1959, a German scientist and lawyer, developed a method of verifying the authenticity of ancient documents. He discovered nearly all of the ancient and early medieval Western European documents to have been either copied or forged in a more recent age. He came to the conclusion that both ancient and medieval history were falsified and wrote several books on the topic. Immanuel Velikovsky, 1895 to 1979, a prominent psychoanalyst of Russian origin, lived and worked in Russia, the UK, Palestine, Germany, and the USA. He wrote a number of books on ancient history that concern several contradictions and peculiarities of ancient history. He also made an attempt of explaining them in relation to the catastrophism theory. He is considered to be the founder of the critical school in chronology, but what he really did can be regarded as an attempt to protect the Scaligian chronology from drastic changes. So his inclusion in the list of the founding fathers of the new chronology is rather arbitrary. Velikovsky's works are better known than the earlier and more detailed ones by N.A. Morozov. This must have inhibited the development of the new chronology in the Western Europe of the 20th century considerably. See details in Chronology 7, Appendix 3. All in all, one has to state that the precariousness of the Scaligian chronology was mentioned rather explicitly in the scientific works of the 17th through 19th century. The Scaligian version of history has been subjected to extended criticisms, and the thesis of the global fabrication of ancient texts and artifacts was formulated. Nevertheless, no one, with the exception of N.A. Morozov, managed to find a way of constructing a proven version of the correct chronology. Even his version was hardly based on any substantial evidence, being incomplete and having inherited a number of substantial flaws from the chronology of Scaliger and Petavius. The second stage. First half of the 20th century. This stage should doubtlessly be linked to the name of N.A. Morozov. He was the first to have understood and formulated the fundamental idea about Scaligian chronology being in need of a complete revision. Not just the ante-mundane part, but also its entire edifice up to the 6th century A.D. N.A. Morozov had used a number of innovative natural scientific methods for chronological analysis and quoted a number of indisputable arguments for proving his brilliant idea. The publication of his main works on the revision of the ancient history occurred in 1907 through 1932. However, he held the erroneous opinion that post-6th century chronology had been basically correct. See details, Chronology 1, Chapter 1-3. The third stage. The period of 1945 through 1973 can be characterized as one of deliberate muting. The historical science tries to cast the chronological research of N.A. Morozov and his predecessors into oblivion. The chronological discussions in Russia cease altogether, and an alienation zone of sorts is created around N.A. Morozov's works on chronology, whereas in the West, the debate becomes circular and doesn't venture outside I. Velikovsky's hypothesis of catastrophism. The fourth stage, which was the period of 1973 through 1980, commenced in 1973 when A.T. Fomenko, faculty member of the Department of Mathematics and Mechanics of the Moscow State University, was researching several problems related to celestial mechanics. He had noticed in the 1972 article of the American astrophysicist Robert Newton, where the latter described a strange leap in lunar acceleration and the so-called parameter d. The leap occurred around the 10th century A.D., using the Skeligerian datings of the writings that make reference to lunar and solar eclipses. R. Newton computed lunar acceleration as a time function on the interval of the 1st through 20th century A.D. The leap in question comprises an entire mathematical order, with an exclamation point, and cannot be explained by the gravitational theory in any way. It was the issue of the discussion organized by the Royal Society of London and the British Academy of Sciences in 1972, and one that had spawned major controversy. The discussion had failed to elucidate the situation in any way, and so R. Newton suggested to attribute the leap to certain mysterious extra gravitational forces in the Earth-Moon system. A.T. Fomenko noted that all the attempts of explaining the gap in the behavior of D failed to raise the issue of the veracity of the eclipse dating that were the actual basis for R. Newton's calculations. However, despite the fact that A.T. Fomenko was well outside the paradigm of historical research back in the day, he had heard that N.A. Morozov offered some new datings of the ancient eclipses in his work entitled Christ, published in 1924 through 1932. It has to be said that A.T. Fomenko's initial attitude towards N.A. Morozov's works was rather skeptical and based on whatever random information he had received on the subjects during informal discussions with fellow faculty members. Nevertheless, having overcome his skepticism, A.T. Fomenko unearthed an astronomical table by N.A. Morozov that contained the new datings and performed a new calculation of the parameter d. Using the same algorithm offered by R. Newton, he was amazed to discover the disappearance of the mysterious leap and the transformation of the D diagram into an even, practically horizontal line. A.T. Fomenko's work on the topic was published in 1980. However, the elimination of the enigma from celestial mechanics led to another question of paramount importance. What was one supposed to do with the chronology of the ancient times in this case? The eclipse dates were supposed to be evidentially linked to a vast array of historical materials. Since N.A. Morozov's works helped to solve a complex celestial mechanics problem, A.T. Fomenko decided to study them in more detail. The only professor from the MSU Department of Mathematics and Mechanics to have had Morozov's Christ already in bibliographical curiosity by that time in his possession was M. Postnikov. He was interested in N.A. Morozov's research and occasionally told his colleagues about it. In 1974, A.T. Fomenko approached M. Postnikov with the suggestion of reading a series of introductory lectures on N.A. Morozov's works. M. Postnikov had acquiesced after a brief hesitation, and read 5 lectures for a group of mathematicians that worked in the MSU Department of Mathematics and Mechanics later the same year. As a result, a group of mathematicians developed an interest in chronological problems, regarding them from the point of view of applied mechanics. It became obvious that the complexity of this issue demanded the development of new independent methods of dating. Hence, the main focus in 1973 through 1980 was on developing methods of analyzing historical texts that were based on mathematical statistics, a number of which was proposed and formulated by A.T. Fomenko in 1975 through 1979. They allowed for the elucidation of the global picture of chronological misdatings in Scaliger's version and elimination. More specifically, A.T. Fomenko had discovered 3 important chronological shifts of roughly 333 years, 1053 and 1800 years respectively. These shifts are only inherent in the erroneous chronology of Scaliger-Petavius and have nothing to do with the correct one. It turned out that the Scaligerian textbook was compiled from 4 copies of one and the same brief chronicle. The first scientific publication on this topic were composed and prepared for publishing in 1973 through 1980. The 5th stage, 1980 through 1990, can be characterized by the publication of articles on the new methods of dating and achieved chronological results in specialized periodicals dedicated to pure and applied mathematics. The first publications on the topic were the 2 articles by A.T. Fomenko and published in 1980, as well as the preprint by A.T. Fomenko and M.M. Postnikov, published the same year. In 1981, a young mathematician by the name of G.V. Nosovsky, specializing in probability theory and mathematical statistics, actively joined the new chronology research. This period saw the publication of several dozens of scientific articles on independent empirico-statistical and astronomical methods in chronology. They were written by A.T. Fomenko, either alone or in collaboration with the mathematicians G.V. Nosovsky, V.V. Kalashnikov, S.T. Rashev, V.V. Fyodorov, and N.S. Kalin. See bibliography. It has to be mentioned that the research was supported by academician E.P. Velikov, the physicist, and proposed 2 of A.T. Fomenko's articles with the description of methods and a global picture of chronological misdatings to be submitted to the Doklady ANSSR, a periodical of the USSR Academy of Sciences. An academician, Y.V. Prokhorov, the mathematician, that had done the same for 2 articles by A.T. Fomenko, V.V. Kalashnikov, and G.V. Nosovsky on the issue of dating Ptolemy's Almagest. A.T. Fomenko made reports concerning the new dating methods in scientific seminars on mathematics conducted by academician V.S. Vladimirov, academician A.A. Samarsky, academician O.A. Olyanik, and corresponding member S.V. Yablonsky, as well as a scientific seminar on history conducted by academician I.D. Kovalchenko, a specialist on applying mathematical methods to history, who was genuinely interested in those methods and claimed that historians needed to delve deeper into chronology issues. Over the period of 1980 to 1990, A.T. Fomenko, G.V. Nosovsky, and V.V. Kalashnikov presented their reports on the new methods of independent dating at a number of scientific conferences on mathematics. The position of academician A.N. Kolmogorov in this respect is most interesting. When A.T. Fomenko was presenting a scientific report on the new methods of dating at the Third International Conference on Probability Theory and Mathematical Statistics in Vilnius, 1981, A.N. Kolmogorov came to the presentation and spent the entire 40-plus minutes that it took standing in the back of the hall, having strategically chosen a spot where he wouldn't be seen from the hall, retaining the ability to see and hear everything that was going on at the blackboard. A.N. Kolmogorov departed immediately after the presentation and did not approach the person at the blackboard. It has to be said that A.N. Kolmogorov's health was already quite frail by that time, and being forced to stand for 40 minutes must have taken a considerable effort on his part. Later on in Moscow, A.N. Kolmogorov invited A.T. Fomenko over to his residence and inquired whether he could borrow any of his publications on chronology. He was given a brief 100-page essay written by A.T. Fomenko in 1979 that had circulated around as a manuscript prior to its publication as a preprint in 1981. Apart from that, A.T. Fomenko had given A.N. Kolmogorov a more exhaustive 500-page typewritten text on the topic. In 2 weeks' time, A.N. Kolmogorov invited A.T. Fomenko to converse with him once again. During the 2-hour discussion, it became clear that A.N. Kolmogorov had made a thorough study of the materials. He had asked a large number of questions, and his primary concern was about the dynastical parallelisms between the ancient dynasties, including the biblical ones, and those of the Middle Ages. He said he was frightened by the possibility of a radical reconstruction of several modern conceptions based on ancient history. He had no objections to the legitimacy of the methods. Finally, A.N. Kolmogorov gave the 500-page text back to A.T. Fomenko and asked whether he could keep the 100-page essay as a present. The request was complied with. One has to add the following report that A.T. Fomenko received orally from one of the partakers of the conversation, that it is to be described below. A while ago, Professor M.M. Postnikov submitted an article with an overview of N.A. Morozov's chronological research in a journal titled Uspeki Matematický Nauk, or The Success of Mathematical Sciences. The following dispute among members of the journal's editing board, among them academicians P.S. Alexandrov and A.N. Kolmogorov, ensued. A.N. Kolmogorov refused so much as to touch the article, saying something along the lines of, quote, "This article is to be rejected. I spent enough time and effort fighting Morozov in the days of yore. However," he added the following, "and yet we shall all look perfectly idiotic if it turns out that Morozov was right." The article was rejected. This conversation sheds some light on the events of the days when N.A. Morozov's research was practically vetoed. Today we are being convinced that everything that happened, quote, automatically, unquote, and then N.A. Morozov's research was of little enough interest to have been forgotten by everyone in a short time. We are now beginning to understand that the forces opposing N.A. Morozov were all the more formidable to have needed the assistance of A.N. Kolmogorov. It is also noteworthy that A.N. Kolmogorov considered it possible for N.A. Morozov to have been correct. Apparently, ever since the time N.A. Morozov research was cast into oblivion, historians have been constantly bothered by the possibility of someone resuming it It is hard to find another explanation for the particular fact that as early as 1977, when the research conducted by the Moscow State University mathematicians was in its earliest stages without any publications on the topic, the Communist magazine published an article by A. Manfred, Doctor of History, with a severe criticism of the new mathematical methods in history. The names of the method's authors were mentioned, but the implications were perfectly clear. Their names weren't mentioned, I'm sorry, but the implications were perfectly clear. A. Manfred wrote the following, quote, "If these, quote, young scientists are given any degree of liberty at all, they will drown the book market in summaries of numeric data. The, quote, new tendencies need to be overcome by scrupulous critical analysis, since they are holding back the progress of global historical science." From the Communist, July 1977, 10th issue, pages 106 through 114. In 1981, immediately after our first publications on chronology had come out, the History Department of the USSR Academy of Sciences gathered for a special session on July 29, 1981, the criticism of our work being its main objective. The learned secretary of the History Department of the USSR Academy of Sciences, Canned Hist Science V.V. Volkov, and the learned secretary of the Principal Tendencies of Human Society Development Council of the History Department of the Academy, N.D. Lutskov, sent A.T. Fomenko an official note saying, among other things, that, quote, "the department's session took place on 29 June 1981, conducted by the Vice Academician Secretary of the Department, Academician Y.V. Bromley. Your conclusions were sharply criticized by the specialists of 6 Humanities Institute, as well as the staff members of the Sternberg Institute of Astronomy, 8 May 1984. The most vehement criticisms of the 1981 session belonged to the corresponding member of the USSR Academy of Sciences, Z.V. Udaltsova, and the chairwoman of the commission, Y.S. Golubtsova, both of them historians. Y.S. Golubtsova was in charge of a special commission of historians that had been assembled to analyze our works. The materials of the discussion had provided the basis for a series of articles with harsh criticisms of our research in various historical periodicals. A similar, in quotes, discussion recurred in 1998 through 1999, as shall be mentioned below. The sixth stage. The post-1990 period, it can be characterized as, quote, the stage of publishing books on new chronology, unquote. This is when the books that covered our chronological research, as well as those containing derived hypotheses about what pre-17th century history had really looked like, started to appear. The first book on this topic was A.T. Fomenko's Methods of Statistical Analysis of Narrative Texts and Their Application to Chronology, MSU Publishing, 1990. The foreword was written by A.N. Shiriev, president of the International Bernoulli Society for Mathematical Statistics and Probability Theory in 1989 through 1991, corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Doctor of Physics and Mathematics, head of the Probability Theory Studies section of Moscow State University Department of Mathematics and Mechanics, head of the Probability Theory and Mathematical Statistics Department of the V.A. Steklov Mathematics Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences. It has to be mentioned that this book was supposed to have been published much earlier. It was already typeset by the publishing house of the Saratov University in 1983 through 1984 and edited by Canned History Science S.A. Pustovoit, Moscow. However, the publishing house received a sudden missive from the historians of Leningrad, head of the university history sector, the Leningrad division of the USSR History Institute, corresponding member of the USSR Academy of Sciences, V.I. Rotenberg. Learned Secretary T.N. Tatsenko, Canned Hist Science, head of the History Ancient States formerly on the USSR territory, and the Ancient World Group, I.A. Shishova. Canned Hist Science, Learned Secretary I.V. Koklina. Canned Hist Science, among other things, they wrote that our research was, quote, obviously contradicting the founding principles of the Marxist historical science, ... The university history sector, as well as the history of ancient states formerly on the USSR territory and the Ancient World Group, considering the publication of A.T. Fomenko's Methods of Statistical Analysis of Narrative Texts and Their Applications to Chronology, an absolute impossibility, unquote. The historians demanded the publication of the book to be stopped in the most categorical way, and so the typesetting of the book was recycled. The Nauka Publishing House planned to publish our book titled The Geometrical and Statistical Analysis of Star Configurations, the Dating of the Star Catalog of Almagest, authored by A.T. Fomenko, V.V. Kalashnikov, and G.V. Nosovsky in 1991. It was reviewed and submitted for publishing. However, when a significant part of work had already been done, the Nauka Publishing House all but ceased its publishing activity due to the change of the political and economical climate in the country. The book was published later, in 1995, by the Factorial Publishing House that had received the prepared materials from Nauka, which would subsequently resume work and publish 2 more of our books on chronology in 1996 and 1997. As we can see, the release of A.T. Fomenko's Methods in 1990 was followed by a break of sorts. After that, starting in 1993, a number of books covering the current stages of our research eventually got published. This was when the term New Chronology had been coined in reference to the chronology that was beginning to emerge due to the application of our new dating methods. It was new in the sense of differing from the consensual chronology of Scaliger-Petavius and should have really been called the correct chronology due to its freedom from the errors of the Scaligerian school. The publication of books on the new chronology was undertaken by a number of Muscovite publishing houses, MSU Publishing, the MSU Educational Center of Pre-University Education Publishing, as well the publishing houses Nauka, Factorial, Kraft, Olymp, Anvik, and Delovoy Express. Outside Russia, our books on chronology were published in both English and Russian by Kluwer Academic Press, the Netherlands, CRC Press, USA, and Edwin Mellon Press, USA. In 2000 to 2003, the entire material was collected, processed, and arranged as the 7 volumes of chronology. What you are now holding in your hands now is the first volume of 7. Starting in 1995 through 1996, a large number of articles discussing our books on the new chronology began to appear in various newspapers and magazines. Most of them expressed two polar points of view. One camp enjoyed our books a great deal, whilst the other was positively infuriated by them. About 100 of such articles appeared every year. Their numbers surged dramatically in 1999 through 2000. In 1998, the Free Russia radio station had been broadcasting a series of radio programs for over 6 months, where Y.S. Chernyshov brilliantly rendered the contents of our books. Namely, he had read the nearly complete text of the two of our books on the radio, The Empire and The New Chronology of Russia, England, and Rome. In addition to that, the first couple of chapters of the Biblical Russia also received a reading. The programs were resumed in 2001, but ceased shortly after that, despite Y.S. Chernyshov's being ready to continue with them. In 1998, 7 series of the Night Flight program on TVC, produced by ATV Studios, aka Author Television, hosted by A.M. Maximov, featured A.V. Podojnistin, a Muscovite economist and a member of the informal New Chronology organization, as their special guest. A.V. Podojnitsin had related the main points of our research and answered a great many of the viewers' questions live. The programs had caused a great resonance. In 2001 and 2002, G.K. Kasparov, the world chess champion, voiced his support of the critical part of the New Chronology publicly. In 1999, the prominent writer, sociologist, logician, and philosopher A.A. Zinoviev, who had just returned to Russia after many years spent in emigration, got in touch with us, having read some of our publications. He decided that our concept was generally a correct one, concurring well with his own research in the field of history and historical falsifications. He voices a number of related ideas in his preface to the new edition of our Introduction to the New Chronology, 2001, Craft Publishing. Craft with a K, Publishing. In 1996, our materials on the New Chronology started to appear online. The number of related websites keeps on growing, and at the moment there are about 10 of them in Russia and at least one in Germany, which is the brainchild of Professor E.Y. Gebovich, Karlsruhe and Potsdam, Germany, the founder of the New German Salon of History, the institution where the New Chronology has been discussed very actively over the last couple of years. E.Y. Gebovich has also helped us immensely with archive research he has conducted in Germany. A number of valuable ideas and considerations of his have helped with the reconstruction of the true history. The website is currently becoming increasingly popular in Russia, offering constant discussion opportunities for both proponents and opponents of the New Chronology. Its URL is chronologia.org. See also history.mithec.com. That's chronologia.org and history.mithec.com. The reaction of historians during the period of 1990 through 1998 was rather lukewarm, and didn't go beyond the odd occasional article whose authors didn't even bother to give scientific counter-arguments, but merely expressed their disapprobation. The radical change came about in 1998. One of the Presidium sessions of the Russian Academy of Sciences was gathered with the sole purpose of discussing our research. Later on, the History Department Bureau of the Academy was called for a special session, and the issue was also discussed at the subsequent session of the Mathematics Department Bureau. The History Department Bureau had proposed an entire combat plan for opposing the new chronology, which was implemented most visibly in December 1999, when the History Department of the MSU organized a large conference successively enough named, quote, "The Myths of the New Chronology," unquote. The main point of the conference agenda was that of a categorical deprecation of our research, and the conclusion was made that the new research should be pronounced perfectly unacceptable. All research concerning the new chronology was to be banned, and its authors reprimanded severely. See details in Chronology 7, Appendix 4. A rather amusing process commenced shortly afterwards. The materials of this conference were published several times under different titles and covers with minute variations. Our opponents went so far as to publish a whole series of books under the title of Anti-Fomenko. There are 7 such books to date, and all of them duplicate each other. It looks like their number might grow in near future. We familiarized ourselves with the criticisms thoroughly and learned that the historians haven't managed to find any original counter-arguments. The material was presented in a more scientific and advanced manner, with considerable progress made in the fine art of attaching labels. We have written a detailed reply, see Chronology 7, Appendix 4. Starting with 1996, a number of books proving the falsity of Western European medieval chronology were published by German scientists, see Chronology 7, Appendix 3. However, the authors of works appeared to misperceive the entire scale of the problem, thinking that several minor local corrections of the Scaliger chronology should suffice. This is a mistake that they need to become aware of before they succeed in any of their endeavors. At the same time, the critical part of those works is written thoroughly enough. The first book that has to be mentioned in this respect is Uwe Topper's The Great Campaign on the Falsification of History, as well as C-14 Crash by Bloss and Nimitz, that conveys to us the knowledge of radiocarbon analysis. See bibliography. The years 2000 through 2001 have been marked by the publication of such books as The True History of Russia and Multi-Optional History by Alexander Gotz, a mathematician from Omsk, and N.I. Khodorkovsky's The Temporal Spiral, A. Bushkov's The Russia That Never Was, is also visibly influenced by our works. This list can be continued. Despite the fact that the key chronological issues are not related in these books, they unravel several new and interesting facts that confirm our general concept. However, we must firmly disagree with a number of ideas voiced in these works and ones similar to them. Being in favor of such activity in general, we beg to differ between these works and our scientific research of chronology. We regard ascribing what we clearly did not say to us or speaking on behalf of the new chronology without our consent as perfectly unacceptable. All that we deem worth relating is already published in our books, or will be formulated in the upcoming ones. They remain the original source for the entire concept of the new chronology. It is also unacceptable to ascribe our ideas and results, leave alone the basic postulates of our concept to others. We thoroughly depreciate the use of the term that we coined along with the entire concept of new chronology for the propaganda of views that we do not share. Let us mention another interesting effect. The recent publication of certain authors is clearly derivative, spawned by the echoes of new chronology. Such, quote, informational reverberations, unquote, are doubtlessly of use. Nevertheless, one has to bear in mind that they neither constitute the essence of the new chronology nor its foundations, namely the natural scientific dating methods and the new concept of history that has evolved from those as our hypotheses. Any attempts to replace the foundations of the new chronology with derivative observations of linguistical or historical nature may create the illusion of being essential or evidential to the new chronology. This is untrue. The conception is based on statistical and astronomical dating methods, first and foremost. From A.T. Fomenko, G.V. Nosovsky, April 2001. Now, before digging into the meat of Chronology 1, there is the publisher's advice. History, fiction or science, comprises data, illustration, charts, and formulae containing irrefutable evidence of mathematical, statistical, and astronomical nature. You may as well skip all of it during your first reading. They were included in this introductory volume as ammunition for your eventual discussions with the avid devotees of classical chronology. In fact, before reading this book, you have most probably been one of such devotees. After reading history, fiction, or science, you will develop a more critical attitude to the dominating historical discourse or even become its antagonist. You will be confronted with natural disbelief when you share what you've learned with others. Now you are very well armed in the face of inevitable skepticism. This book contains enough solid evidence to silence any historian by the sheer power of facts and argumentation. And now, the problems of historical chronology. Quote, one often comes across accounts of a steel chisel found in the external masonry of the Great Pyramid of Cheops, Khufu, the beginning of 30th century BC. However, it is indeed most probable that said tool got there in a later age, when the pyramid stones were pillaged for building purposes. From Michel Gouya, The History of Chemistry, Moscow, 1975, page 27, comment 23. Section 1, Roman chronology as the foundation of European chronology. Let us give a concise preliminary account of the current state of ancient and medieval chronology. The importance of chronology for historical science is all the greater since this discipline allows for the determination of the time interval between the historical event and the current era, provided it can be adequately translated into terms of contemporary chronology. That is to say, it is given a corresponding BC/AD dating. Nearly all the fundamental historical conclusions depend on the dating of the events described in the source that is being studied. An altered or imprecise dating of an event defines its entire interpretation and evaluation. The current global chronology model has evolved owing to the labor of several generations of chronologists in the 17th through 19th century, and has Julian calendar datings ascribed to all the major events of ancient history. The datings of events referred to in some freshly discovered document are predominantly based on the Roman chronology, since it is considered that, quote, all the other ancient chronological datings can be linked to our calendar via direct or indirect synchronisms with the Roman dates, unquote. In other words, Roman chronology and history are the, quote, spinal column, unquote, of the consensual global chronology and history. This is why Roman history shall have to enjoy our very special attention. Section 2. Scaliger, Petavius, and other clerical chronologers. Special attention to clerical chronologers. The creation of contemporary chronology of the ancient times in the 16th through 17th century A.D. The chronology of ancient and medieval history in its present form was created and for the most part concluded in a series of fundamental works of the 16th through 17th century that begins with the writings of Iosifus Eustace Scaliger, 1540 through 1609, called, quote, the founder of modern chronology as a science, unquote, by the modern chronologist E. Bickerman. The medieval portrait of I. Scaliger, or J. Scaliger, Joseph Iosif. I'm sorry, that's my interjection because they say that we didn't start using J's in English till about the 16th century. The portrait of I. Scaliger can be seen on figure 1-1. This is an etching from Athena Batavia, a book by Johannes Mercius, 35, page 25. Scaliger's principal works on chronology are as follows. 1. Scaliger 1. Opus Novum de Emendatione Temporum. Lutetiac, Paris, 1583. And 2. Scaliger I, not Scaliger 1, I'm sorry, Scaliger I as in Eosif. Thesaurus Temporum, 1606. For the most part, the body of Scaliger's work was concluded by Dionysius Petavius, 1583 through 1652. The best-known book of the latter is titled De Doctrina Temporum, Paris, 1627. Figures 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4 show the title page of this Rationarium Temporum, published in 1652, and the titles of the first 2 volumes. Gerhard Friedrich Miller, 1705 through 1783, quote, revised, unquote, the Russian history and chronology in the 18th century, accordance with Scaliger's scheme. His portrait can be seen on figure 1.5. See more about the endeavors of Miller and his German colleagues in Chronology 4. Let us mention the works of the 18th through 19th century, which contain a great array of factual chronological data, such as 1155, 1205, 1236, and 1275. They are of great value to us, since they provide a snapshot of the state of chronology during the epoch of a greater proximity to Scaliger and Petavius. This material is thus of a more primordial nature, not, quote, painted over, unquote, by latter cosmetic layers. It must be noted that this series remains incomplete, as well as several other similar chronological works. To quote the prominent contemporary chronologist E. Bickerman, there has been no chronological research ever conducted that could be called exhaustive and conforming to modern standards. Hence, it would be correct to call the modern consensual chronology of the classical period and the Middle Ages the Scaliger-Petavius version. We shall simply refer to it as Scaligerian chronology. As it will be pointed out, this version wasn't the only one existing in the 17th through 18th century. Its veracity has been questioned by eminent scientists. The ground-laying works of Scaliger and Petavius of the 16th through 17th century present the ancient chronology as a table of dates given without any reasons whatsoever. It is declared to have been on ecclesiastical tradition. This is hardly surprising since, quote, history has remained predominantly ecclesial for centuries and for the most part was written by the clergy, unquote. Today it is believed that the foundations of chronology were laid by Eusebius Pamphilus and Saint Hieronymus, allegedly in the 4th century A.D. On figure 1.6 we have a medieval painting of Eusebius Pamphilus of Caesarea, dated 1455. It is worth noting that Eusebius of Caesarea is painted wearing typically medieval attire of the Renaissance epoch, most probably because he had lived in that period of time and not any earlier. Despite the fact that Scaligerian histories ascribe Eusebius to the 4th century A.D. during the years 260 through 340, it is interesting to note that his famous work entitled The History of Time from the Genesis to the Nicene Council, the so-called Chronicle, as well as the tractate by Saint Hieronymus or Jerome, weren't discovered until very late in the Middle Ages. Apart from that, historians say that the Greek original of Eusebius A.F. is only available in fragmentary form nowadays and is complemented by the ad libitum translation made by Saint Hieronymus. Mark the fact that Nicephorus Callistus attempted to write a new history of the first 3 centuries in the 14th century, or, in quotes, revise the history of Eusebius, but, quote, he could not do more than repeat that which was written by Eusebius, unquote. However, since the work of Eusebius was only published in 1544, that is much later than the writing of Nicephorus, one has reason to wonder, could the, in quotes, ancient Eusebius have based his work on the medieval tractate by Nicephorus Callistus? On figure 1.7, we can see a painting by Cesare Nebbia and Giovanni Ghera that was allegedly created in 1585 through 1590. According to historians, it depicts a scene of St. Jerome and his pet lion visiting the library of Eusebius, whose chronicle was translated by Jerome in Caesarea. What we see here, however, is a typically medieval scene of the Renaissance epoch, or maybe even the epoch of the 16th through 17th century. The library shelves are filled with books that look basically the same as those of the 18th through 19th century, in hardcovers with wide fastening straps. The artists of the 16th through 17th century have most probably painted recent medieval events and characters cast into the, quote, Dark Ages by later 17th through 18th century chronologists of the Scaligerian tradition. It is assumed that Scaligerian chronology was based on the interpretations of assorted numeric data collected from the Bible. Certain basis dates that were used as reference points originated as results of scholastic exercises with numbers. For instance, according to the eminent chronologist J. Usher, the world was created on Sunday, 23 October 4004 BC, in the small hours of the morning. Mind-boggling precision. One is to bear in mind that the secular chronology of the present days is largely based on the scholastic biblical chronology of the Middle Ages. E. Bickerman, a contemporary historian, is perfectly right to note that, quote, the Christian historians have made secular chronology serve ecclesiastical history, ... The compilation made by Hieronymus is the foundation of the entire edifice of Occidental chronological knowledge, unquote. Although, quote, I. Scaliger, the founding father of modern chronology as a science, had attempted to reconstruct the entire tractate of Eusebius, unquote. As E. Bickerman tells us, quote, the datings of Eusebius that often got transcribed erroneously in manuscripts, and we have a exclamation point -AF, are hardly of any use to us nowadays. So again, Bickerman tells us the datings of Eusebius that often got transcribed erroneously in manuscripts are hardly of any use to us nowadays. And I am going to try to skip most of the often inserted notation for scholastic reasons, for ease of reading and listening. Due to the controversy and the dubiety of these medieval computations, the Genesis dating, for instance, varies greatly from document to document. Let us quote the main examples. 5969 BC, the Antiochian dating according to Theophilus. See other version below. 5508 BC, the Byzantine dating, also known as the Constantinople version. 5493 BC, Alexandrian, the Annian era, also 5472 BC or 5624 BC. 4004 BC, according to Ussher, a Hebraic dating. 5872 BC, the so-called dating of the 70 interpreters. 4700 BC, Samaritan. 3671 BC, Judaic. 3491 BC, according to Hieronymus. 5199 BC, according to Eusebius of Caesarea. 5500 BC, according to Hippolytus and Sextus Julius Africanus. 5515 BC, also 5507 BC, according to Theophilus. 5551 BC, according to Augustine. As we can see, this temporal reference point, considered fundamental for the ancient chronology, fluctuates within the span of 2,100 years. We have only quoted the most famous examples here. It is expedient to know that there are about 200 various versions of the Genesis date in existence. On figure 1.8, you can see an ancient painting of the 70 Bible translators, commonly referred to as the 70 interpreters today. The correct Genesis dating issue was far from scholastic and received plenty of attention in the 17th through 18th century for good reason. The matter here is that many ancient documents date events in years past, quote, since Adam, or since the Genesis. This is why the existing millenarian discrepancies between the possible choices of this reference point substantially affect the datings of many ancient documents. I. Scaliger, together with D. Petavius, were the first ones to have used the astronomical method for proving, but not examining critically, the late medieval version of the chronology of the preceding centuries. Modern commentators consider Scaliger to have ipso facto transformed this chronology into a, in quotes, scientific one. This scientific veneer proved sufficient for the chronologists of the 17th through 18th century to put unquestioning trust in the largely rigidified chronological date grid that they had inherited. It is very significant that Scaligean chronology was initially created within the paradigm of the Western European Catholic Church, which had remained in its firm control for a great amount of time. A. Oleynikov wrote, quote, "The medieval theologians often tried to calculate the age of the earth, interpreting assorted data contained in the Holy Writ," unquote. On having studied the text of the Bible, Archbishop Hieronymus came to the conclusion that the world was created 3,941 years before the beginning of modern chronology. His colleague, Theophilus, the bishop of Antiochia, had extended this period to 5,515 years. St. Augustine had added another 36 years, whilst the Irish Archbishop James Ussher, who had obviously nurtured a fondness for precise numbers, had made the assumption that the world was created in the early morning hours on 23rd of October 4004 BC. Many eminent Western European chronologists of the 16th through 17th century were clergymen. I. Scaliger, 1540 through 1609, for instance, was the theologian Tischendorf, 1815 through 1874, the founding father of paleography, was a doctor of divinity. Dionysius Petavius, 1583 through 1652, a Jesuit and an author of several theological works. I'm sorry if those names seem to overlap. I hope you didn't get the impression that he was saying Scaliger is Tischendorf. I apologize for that. He was simply giving the list of these particular names of clergymen that had to do with these chronologies and datings. Their absolute trust in the infallibility of what the ecclesial chronology was telling them determined their entire Weltanschauung. Therefore, their attitude to the data offered by other disciplines was determined by whether or not it could serve the advocacy of this a priori assumption, or the other, invariably based on the medieval ecclesial chronology that was later baptized, in quotes, scientific. The fact that the clerical chronologists of the Occidental Church had defied the endeavors of their predecessors of the 15th through 16th century excluded the very possibility of criticizing the foundations of chronology in any way at all, even minutely. I. Scaliger, for instance, could not even conceive of such heresy as running a check on the chronological materials of the Holy Fathers, Eusebius and others. Quote, Scaliger calls this work by Eusebius, the Evangelical Preparation, divine. Page 8, Introduction. That was a reference. Trusting the authority of their predecessors unconditionally, the chronologists reacted at external criticisms very bitterly. The same I. Scaliger makes a perfect demonstration of his attitude towards objective scientific criticisms in the following episode. Quote, the eminent philologist Joseph D. Scaliger, the author of the chronology that has received such high scientific acclaim, turned into a keen quadraturist. Let us remind that a quadraturist was someone who tried to build a square equaling a given circle or disk in area, using nothing but a pair of compasses and a ruler. This mathematical problem is insoluble as a principle, which is proven by geometry. However, I. Scaliger had published a book where he claims to have proved the true quadrature, which solved the problem. The best mathematicians of the epoch, Viet, Clavius, have tried their hardest to prove to him that his reasoning was incorrect, all in vain. The point here is that Scaliger's erroneous proof, in quotes, made the easy corollary about the perimeter of an equilateral polygon with 196 angles being greater than that of the circle circumscribing it, which is naturally quite absurd. Nevertheless, quote, Scaliger and his supporters, who had a habit of defending their opinions vehemently, didn't want to acknowledge anything, replying with maledictions and scornful epithets, and finally calling all the geometricians complete ignoramuses in what concerned geometry. And this is my commentary. Scaliger and his companions resorted to name-calling and ad hominem attacks when they were shown that they were wrong. One might imagine how these people reacted towards attempts of analyzing their version of chronology critically. Few are aware that Scaliger and Petavius brought chronology to, quote, perfection and absolutely precise datings, quoting the year, day, month, and sometimes even the time of day for all the principal events in history of humankind. For whatever reason, modern monographies and textbooks usually only quote the years of the events according to Scaliger-Petavius, coyly omitting the month, day, and hour. It is verily a step backwards that deprives the chronology calculated in the 17th through 18th century of its former splendor and fundamentality. By the 19th century, the accumulated volume of chronological material had grown to the extent of inducing respect a priori by its sheer scale. So the chronologists of the 19th century saw their objective in making minor corrections and not much else. The issue of veracity is hardly raised at all in the 20th century, and the ancient chronology solidifies terminally in the very shape and form given to it by the writings of Eusebius, Hieronymus, Theophilus, Augustine, Hippolytus, Saint Clement of Alexandria, Ussher, Scaliger, and Petavius. To someone in our day and age, the very thought that historians have followed an erroneous chronology for about 3 centuries seems preposterous, since it contradicts the existing tradition. However, as chronology developed, specialists encountered considerable difficulties in trying to correlate the varied chronological data offered by ancient sources with the consensual Scaligerian version. It was discovered, for instance, that Hieronymus misdates his own time by 100 years. The so-called Sassanid tradition separated Alexander the Great from the Sassanids by an interval of 226 years, which was extended to 557 by contemporary historians. In any case, the gap exceeds 300 years. The Jews also allocate a mere 52 years for the Persian period of their history, despite the fact that Cyrus II is separated from Alexander the Great by 206 years, according to the Scaligerian chronology. The basic Egyptian chronology has also reached us through the filter of Christian chronologists. Quote, the list of kings compiled by Menathon only survived as quotations made by the Christian authors. Some readers might be unaware that, quote, the Oriental Church avoided using the birth of Christ as a chronological point of reference, since in Constantinople the debates about the date of his birth had continued well into the 14th century. All right, at this point, I will pick up next time with Section 3. The veracity of the Scaliger-Petavius chronology was questioned as early as the 16th century. Again, as I said in the last video, if you want to hear a little bit more about Joseph Scaliger, Petavius, and others, events occurring around their time, the family history of Scaliger, the tactics he was known to employ, you can see the series that Jacob Duellman did on the Gnostic Media podcast Unspun with Jan Irvin, because that is most of the bulk of material on social media that I am aware of concerning Scaliger and these issues with, amongst other things, his honesty. Now, concerning some of the issues that were at first vexing me and may yet still be vexing others, concerning how would it be that A.T. Fomenko would be able to produce these works if they were causing such damage to the system. The thing is, paying attention to what he recollected over the years of first having his attention drawn to the issues of chronology as they relate to celestial movements, which is mathematics and all. If he's being truthful with us, which I would imagine, since there are so many names that he carefully documents that were involved in these events over a large period of time, that anyone who was interested could probably easily fact check, find out if these things be so, because it sounds to me like he is chronicling a lot of resistance from the academic community in general. We can see that he also had a great deal of problems with getting his works published. We had stop publishings, and then they had to be picked up by other publishers. None of these publishers are necessarily great publishers, as well as the company that published these chronology books, Delamere. So you always have to weigh out what are the factors and conditions that are being laid out before us as to whether there is a great deal of veracity and honesty in the work or not. Whatever the case may be, it does seem that there will be a great bulk of facts and material to be gained from the full reading of this book, and maybe even perhaps subsequent books, no matter what the case. So, until we pick up again, take care, everyone.